Welcome to another lecture. Today we're going to cover Capote's Shut a Final Door. Overall, we'll look at a literal understanding of the story about Walter, and we'll also take a deeper figurative look at what's going on here with this story. Now we start with Walter. I think I've mentioned before, if you look up the symbolism of a character's name, it kind of clues you in a little bit to perhaps their dilemma, or some thematic ideas that might apply to them. And here we have Walter. And if you look up the meaning of Walter, it does mean ruler of the army. Now, that's the symbolic meaning of the name. The way I always do this is just to kind of go on Google and maybe check a couple different hits to see, because you'll find a lot of different stuff when it comes to names, what they mean, symbolism for, again, kind of flowers, plants, animals, things like that. But it is worth looking up. Walter is ruler of the army. Now, I think if you look carefully enough with the story, it's substantiated that he is the ruler of an army, which represents the opposing force of another force. And he does use the word enemy on a few different accounts in this story. And it's kind of almost like a complete break from the kind of normal aspects of his life. I mean, he's working for an advertising agency, but at the same time, to use the word enemy has very kind of deeper implications, as we'll see. So, I'll just cover one more thing on the first page, another symbolism, just to kind of see if it kind of works for us, and then I'll get into some more specific ideas here for Shut a Final Door. So, Anna is described throughout the story as a confidant, somebody that Walter can confide in and rely on and open up and tell the truth, who's there for Walter to be honest with and vent his feelings and his attitudes. So Anna, if you look up again the symbolism, does represent to have the favor or grace of God, right? So really, generally to have favor and grace, but really more specifically God. And then, believe it or not, in the first page of this short story, it says, "This plain-spoken act of hers, nothing but a cover-up for all her repressed hostility." That's hostility toward, for the most part, Walter. Terrible liar too. Can't believe a word she says. Dangerous, my God. So at least the feelings that she has kind of rises to the level of something on a kind of a divine plateau, right? I found myself, when I was going through this story, that malice and hatred, the malice and hatred that Walter has for many people around him, including his own family. There's a specific paragraph that says he blames his family. But he's got such a hatred and malice, and I would argue that does tend to be one of his biggest character flaws. That leads to all kinds of problems for him, is just that he can't rid himself of this hatred and malice that he feels toward other people. Okay, so just to dwell on Walter for a moment, he is a very I can't remember a story I've read recently where well, I guess I could, but this main character in particular seems to be very upset, depressed, and at a very dark place in his life. I even think there's specific references to darkness here just to give us a sense of that. However, I think the balance here for Walter is the kind of remedy that he's searching for, and the remedy that he's after, and that he's having a hard time obtaining throughout this story, is a profound remedy. So it's almost worth the kind of pain and agony, and really it seems to be the remorseless difficulties that are a part of his life, especially because of the distrust and the hatred and the kind of coldness he feels toward other people. He's a very depressed character, and I think that should be quite noted, but the payoff is massive. And I don't want to really say too much about that early on here, as we'll have evidence for that. So early on too, there's also a mention of the fan blades going around and around, and there's even some weird syntactically speaking, there's some weird sentences where it says, he said, you know, you said, he said, she said, they said, right? Just like this endless kind of cycle of babble and just kind of words. I think that's kind of what Capote's getting at here, but it also, those words seem to have meaning. So really what we're talking about is a meaning or a set of particular meanings that just recycle themselves. So for instance, you'll find this in any great novel, I would imagine. The virtue of kindness is a part of each and every generation that ever kind of passes, right? So here we are in the year 2017, and there's a sense of what compassion is. Maybe it'll be different in 2117, when the idea of compassion maybe shifts a little bit, but it's still endless, and there's a cycle to it. And then at the same time, throughout the ages, there's always going to be feelings of malice and hatred and betrayal, and even they might shift a little bit. I mean, who knows? 2117, what will anger even look like? How will people take out their anger? What's going to be kind of the format or the platform that anger is even kind of a part of? I mean, there's really no saying, but the certainty is that they'll always be there. It's almost like these forces of good and evil, right? I don't like to use that kind of binary way of looking at it because I don't believe in it. I think good and evil is all relative. But sometimes on a certain level, especially when you're talking about God and the forces of good and evil, I guess narratively there does need to be a kind of somebody fighting the good fight in that conflict. So let me just get back into the text here. One of the first people that we run into, the story starts with Anna, who's just being really hard on Walter. As you know, I speak about the whole story here because it's just kind of in my mind. But Anna's also going to be pretty hard on Walter at the end as well. So even after that time passes that this story covers, where sometimes things are pretty good between Anna and Walter, by the end of the text she gives a quite beautiful speech, complex speech, but she basically tells Walter, I'm not even your friend. And reality is not really what it seems, but she gives a reason. I think buried in what she says, there is a reason why she just can't give Walter her blessings and favor any longer. And notice that's kind of what it is. Her name represents God and favor. What is Walter trying to get throughout this entire text? Her favor. See, I think some authors do use it more than others, and I do feel that Capote's kind of utilizing the symbolism of the names here to kind of lead us in certain directions here with his characters. Okay, so Margaret is the next woman to be introduced. And also before this, I think, let me make sure. Yes, Irving. Notice that Irving is introduced early on. First kind of acquaintance, first really person that is introduced in this story, aside from Anna, but in a more kind of descriptive way, we get more about Irving here. And Irving, you look up the symbolism of the name, and this is very substantiated throughout the text. Believe it or not, I found a couple things, but one that kind of worked for me here was stillness and calmness. That Irving represents this idea of stillness and kindness. And being, and I think with that you can equate some other terms like nothing. Sometimes there's an emphasis on he just wanted to feel nothing. And I think that gets back to just still, just be still, calm, right? Not much activity, not much frenetic activity, and I think he uses that word here to describe Margaret, hectic, pretty close. And there's something hectic about Margaret. If you look up the meaning of the name Margaret, what you get is pearl, and also pearl and cluster of blossoms. I think when you think about that meaning, a pearl is one of those things that's just always kind of treasured and sought out and yearned for. It's something that kind of drives us forward. We want the pearl because, I don't know, I guess there's a competition involved who's going to get that pearl underneath it all. Maybe you're lucky enough not to have to compete for these things, but it could be the case. And a bouquet of flowers, it's stuff that we desire. And I think that's a good way to think about Margaret. She represents, for many people, this idea of like desire and having something. So Irving basically kind of loses Margaret to Walter. So I mean, if you're putting the symbolisms together, you have a character who represents stillness and calmness, just kind of being at ease, right? But nothing kind of too much. And he's losing that pearl. He's losing that cluster of blossoms, what we all want. He's losing what he desires to Walter, who again kind of represents ruler of an army. And I'll talk more about that characteristic here in a second as we get into Walter and the advertising agency, what we literally have here in this story. Okay. This is interesting. On the page, well, these are short paragraphs, he says, Walter's talking about Irving to Margaret, and he says, Irving is everybody's little brother. He could never be your husband because he's really your little brother. Irving is everyone's little brother, meaning that stillness and that calmness is a part of every single person out there, right? Everybody has a little brother, which is to say everybody has the characteristic of stillness and calmness in their life. So when Walter says Irving is everyone's little brother, there's something very truthful there as this characteristic of being calm and still and not feeling the need to advance or kind of perpetuate your life in a aggressive or greedy fashion. Just to be still and calm, that characteristic is a part of every single individual. If you think about kind of how the overall conditioning is, as far as like characteristics that lead to success or lead to what we desire, what we want out of life, on a critical level, you ask yourself what characteristics really kind of earn success in life. Well, it all starts a lot in school, and you're led to basically be very kind of self-assured and confident and definitely very kind of prolific. So you're taught to advance, right? You're never taught to just kind of be still or not worry about that advancement. You can see, as it's pretty much, Capote makes it very clear, as soon as we get into the advertising field, Walter becomes quite eager and opportunistic in his field. And that becomes a problem with him and Margaret, what he kind of desired in the first place. And she gives him ample warning about that as well. Okay, so I want to talk about really quickly, early on in the story, who he blames. And all very quickly he blames his mother, his father, and his sister Cecil, who'd marry a man 40 years his senior. 40 years her senior. So if you look at the details here, his churchly mother, that's to basically say the institution of the church, right? Who does he blame? He blames essentially the institution of the church, right? Or his father. His father is linked to financial and insurance, basically just issues of money. Or his sister Cecil, and if you look up the name Cecil, it does represent the idea of being blind or dim-sighted. I found that very interesting, especially because he is kind of likened to the ruler of an army. This is the geek in me, but if you've ever seen, or if you've ever played an early Final Fantasy game, I think it was either 3 or 4, the character is Cecil, and he commits some atrocities on behalf of his army and his government early in the story, which could be this kind of blindness that he has, and of course he has to kind of go against this, and it's a whole struggle. Let me just keep going with the text here. Irvine is a little Jewish boy. He looks very young for his age, so he looks like an adolescent. We've already talked about Margaret being a pearl in a cluster of blossoms. And all of a sudden, Walter immediately just kind of makes these advances. And it all happens in a very short paragraph, but they essentially make love. And even for Capote, I guess that could be his style. But even for anyone really, that's a pretty quick way of describing a relationship that kind of escalates to the point where there is sex involved, and they made love often after that. It was instantaneous. All it took was Walter saying a few demeaning and comments that kind of diminish the character and respectability, or the at least acknowledgement of somebody like Irving, who represents calmness and stillness. Somebody kind of young, who looks very young for his age, which means maybe there's a naivety to it. That's a possibility. Okay, Kuhn. This is a big one. Kurt Kuhnhardt. And if you look up the symbolisms here, first of all, with this name and on Kupperman, Cooper, Rosa Cooper, but Capote makes it a point to tell us that the name is actually from German, I think is what's being implied there. And so Kuhnhardt is the same. We're given a German kind of origin here. I'm not sure exactly why Capote would do that. I don't know if it has something to do with kind of barbarism, which was big in the kind of, I guess, northern areas. You got Latin America, of course, and Rome, who are creating some, major armies and kind of, doing their own stuff too. But maybe it's to reference those barbarian cultures from the north that maybe, I don't know the anthropology to it, but maybe they were quite aggressive and had to be. But here's the symbolism of these names. And again, I think these are very helpful. Kurt is wolf. And if you think about a wolf, there's a prowess, there's an independence, there's a ferociousness when needed, I'm sure. So the wolf is a strong character. I didn't even look up the symbolism of wolf any further, because I think that's kind of what's being, that's the idea here. Look up the German on Kuhn and Hart. Kuhn means bold, Hart means hard. So boldness and hardness. And when hardness, you can think literally hardness, but I think we're also talking about a resolve and a temperament, right? A hard character, meaning callous. There's nothing you can do to get through to me, right? I'm going to be strong. I'm going to stand this ground the way I need to. So hardness and a boldness. I'm going to get ahead, right? A boldness. I'm going to take risks. I'm going to gamble, which we're given a reference to gambling later in this story. All of these things that again come with a more kind of aggressive general human characteristic, as opposed to one that is not aggressive and keeps to itself and can be calm and can be still, leads to Irving getting so mad that he actually comes over, but he's described as faking toughness. It's really not him. He's not really in his element here, acting the way he is, and he actually gives him a very ineffective punch on the chest, which nobody, including the narrator, seems to really make much of. But it does say he swung out as if he clutched a knife. That's pretty strong language, right? Where if he had one, he'd do it. Again, trying to kill Walter. But this is not in the character of Irving. He basically looks like a fool. Margaret and Walter go off, and their relationship in some ways thrives, but we know, of course, nothing will last for Walter. So Walter starts to get involved. Let me make sure I'm not skipping anything. It is important to, I think, remember as we move on that Irving is the first real friend to Walter. Things do change, and maybe change quickly, but Irving, or Stillness and Calmness, was the original friend to Walter. Walter even said, it's everybody's little brother, so everybody's connected to it. So Walter will lose that stillness and calmness here as far as this friendship goes with Irving. And by the end of the text, ironically, on a big level, I guess you could say, he'll be trying to get those qualities back, that stillness and that calmness. In fact, you go to the very last page, very last line. Think of nothing. Think of nothing things. Think of wind. Think of nothing. Stillness, calmness. I think those are easily kind of related ideas, right? A stillness is nothing, right? We want no sound. We want no movement. Okay. So I want to just dwell very quickly on the idea of malice and hatred. These are things that arguably are part of every single person, right? We all have a kind of malice and a hatred to who we are. whether you're angry at your loved one, whether you're angry at your partner, whether you're angry at a son, daughter, mom, dad, right? Whatever it is, guardian, whatever it's going to be. But I think it might be a little bit different for people who go to war and people who fight in wars. It's hard to say because everything's different for everybody. It's very personal. But if I were to kill somebody, if I were to engage what war truly is, which is, you know, the loss of life and taking life, would I have a hatred and a malice toward the people that I was fighting against? Inevitably. Or whatever I did there, would that somehow translate and come back to a certain kind of hatred and malice that I would have for the world? And a guilt, perhaps, too, that I would have for the world. That could be one way of thinking about it on a symbolic level here. Because in literally, we're not really given a good enough reason to understand why he would feel the way he does. Walter is tormented. He's a very angry and upset person, but I don't think on a literal level we're really given enough. He just blames his parents, who of course is church, financial stuff, which is money, and the idea of being blind, right? That's who he blames. But I think if we start to look at it on a more figurative level, we do understand that we're talking about a character who represents the idea of war or engaging in war. So always to keep that in mind. Early on, Walter and Margaret basically go out one night and they go to a party. And then afterward, they go to a little party in honor of Kuhnhardt. So again, we have these characters who are basically, by going to this party to honor Kuhnhardt, they're going to honor the wolf. They're going to honor the characteristics of boldness and hardness, especially within a society where we have these kinds of occupations that we have to get involved with, right? Boldness and hardness. A businessman, I guess if you really want to go to the kind of ultimate example, a businessman we expect to be bold. Even when we talk about the presidency, these are qualities that are highly admired and basically, you know, people spout out about the boldness of this president, right, and the ability to make hard decisions. All right, these are characteristics that we treasure and admire at even the most highest positions of society, and that definitely kind of trickles down, right? So we are honoring these things. Irving, poor Irving, he looked like a little boy playing grown-up, for his legs were too short to reach the stool's footrest. They dangled, doll-like. He even swears. It is Irving who is this stillness and this calmness and this kind of, you know, he's so angry. He even says, I'll kill you, I swear before God I will. Now again, you can take this as quite colloquial, just somebody who's very angry using the term God to kind of express that anger. But I think it's on a more symbolic level, on a more meaningful level. These characteristics are so important that we are talking about levels of God, right? That these characteristics are something that are playing out on a kind of more religious and therefore moral and ethical kind of level. Okay. And he wants it. There's not much he can do. How could he? Up against Walter and what Walter represents. What's he going to do? However, he is very angry. Other crucial thing happens here with Irving. They teach him how to hate. Before Walter stepped onto the scene and started engaging in this relationship with Margaret, it was going well for Irving. They were boyfriend and girlfriend, so everything was just fine. It wasn't until this kind of outside interference or this intrusion, especially an aggressive one like Walter, who says the things that he says and moves in the way that he moves in on Margaret. I mean, they're having sex in one paragraph. It's pretty amazing. But what they've taken from Irving, which is upsetting, I think, as far as Capote's intentions. What they're taking away from him was his ability to be calm and still, and to not fall victim to the types of desires and the types of drives and incentives that are plaguing Walter that he has to deal with. Okay, he starts to develop a relationship with Kurt Kuhnhardt. And early on, I don't even think I'll be covering the page here, but early on, it's Margaret that says, don't get too involved. It happens every time. Every time somebody gets too close or works too hard or becomes kind of infected by the bug of Kuhnhardt, eventually they get fired. We know that that definitely comes true. Margaret tells an accurate kind of prophecy there, right? I mean, that just absolutely does happen. There's no question about it. He gets let go. Okay, Kuhnhardt's office. There's a couple details that I think are interesting. I'll just read this. So within this love triangle, early on in the story, which characteristics win out? Walter's characteristics, military style kind of aggression and aptitude and astuteness. What loses out? A certain kind of sweetness, a certain kind of person who never felt the need to compete or to really advance in this tremorous way that Walter does. Okay, there's a couple details really quickly here that stand out. When I think about military style aggression, I'm not just thinking what's happening on a world stage today. I'm thinking about the colonialism and the imperialism that has basically been going on for thousands of years. We can't forget that kind of military style aggression. And again, if that's been successful for nations, especially Western nations, if that's been in other parts of the world as well, if that's been successful, a certain kind of imperialism, right? Taking what you want, doing what you have to do, not trusting anybody, keeping this kind of mindset where it is you're always wanting to get something, right? Quick idea there. I've heard a couple people say, you think about the 1% or the top whatever percent of the 1% who just have baffling amounts of money. Something that's asked quite commonly is, why do these people need that much money? I mean, when you're talking about billions upon billions upon billions, and knowing that wherever there's gain here, there's loss here, so there's loss somewhere. Some people would ask the question, that's insanity, right? When you want that much money, that's insane, but that's what we find in the world. That's just the way it's going. They want more and more and more. That's the kind of attitude I think we're talking about when we are honoring Kurt Kuhnhardt and trying to become a part of his, to rise up in his institution, right? The KKA, which just sounds weird, right? Because it's missing one K. I don't know if Capote meant for that to sound similar, but it just really does. That's a little strange to me. But I don't think it's KKK. I really don't. I don't think there's enough support for that at all, really. But it just sounds like it, which is very coincidental, perhaps. Couple details. You have Kurt Kuhnhardt's office, and it's furnished with, among other things, and I'll just read a little bit, 3 Picassos, a superb music box, South Sea Island masks, and a burly Danish youngster, the houseboy. These could be random, but when I think South Sea Island, I do think of a certain kind of imperialism. I don't know who is imperializing the South Sea Islands. I would have to look that up, but it's something exotic in a American white man's home, right? So there's always this idea, especially because he's quite German with the Kuhnhardt, so it's giving us a European thing as well, and Europe was kind of where imperialism really, I guess, begins. In that part of the world. Now, I'm not too sure why Capote chooses an advertising agency. Usually, it's only a short story. If it were a novel, it might be different. But usually, if you're going to choose a business in writing, when you're writing a story, something like this, you know a lot about it. And I don't think there's a lot going on here that says that Capote knew the advertising business. I could be wrong, but it just doesn't feel like it. That's not what he's concerned with. But what I want to say about this, we have the idea of war and aggression, and advancement, desire for this advancement, and we also have the advertising agency that Walter is trying to rise up in. So I think it's basically just a business, and I think advertising, like many businesses out there, is probably pretty fast-paced, pretty intricate. When you think, it's a business that requires the drive, the ambition to succeed and stand out amongst other people. Is there a correlation between the characteristics that are needed to be successful in advertising with a kind of military style aggression and an aptitude for war? That's a question. I think there is. I think he kind of experiences these again, kind of good and evil characteristics within the advertising industry, and going after somebody like Kuhnhardt, trying to kind of be a success in his eyes, will ultimately lead to his downfall. Okay. Margaret warns him. It is hard to analyze, but you have to note that it is his advancing relationship with Kuhnhardt that actually kind of leads him to Rosa Cooper. So kind of one does lead to the other. So if you're looking at this on a kind of symbolic level, just something to keep in mind, that it's definitely trying to kind of make it with Kuhnhardt professionally within this advertising industry will lead to the party and the chance kind of encounter of Rosa Cooper. She is Kupperman, so we have another German name here, so it's being linked. I struggle with Rosa as far as like a kind of general idea that she represents in this text. She's definitely, I guess you could say, fame, and she's well established with money, and that's quite desirous. Walter, to speak to this idea, this part of the story at large, I don't think it's true feelings that Walter has for Rosa. I don't know if you could even say he has true feelings for really too many people. That's one of his problems, is that there's no love in his life, and this is mentioned a couple times. So I don't think it's real love that he has for Rosa. I think he is more interested in just the name and the reputation and what will do for his prospects and his overall success. And that, of course, we know doesn't work out as well. Now, one thing, he thinks back to a time where him and Margaret, I think he's rummaging through her things. That's kind of strange. So eventually he starts to break it off, I should say, with Margaret. He gets mad at her for her telling him, to watch it with Kuhnhardt and don't get too involved, right? Don't get too optimistic. And of course, he kind of ignores that. So he breaks it off with Margaret. It's a little unfortunate. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth simply because he took her away from Irving, only to pretty easily break up with Margaret for simply kind of having a certain kind of malice toward her, right? A heavy distrust. Later on, I would imagine, once he starts talking more to Anna Stimson, because we know that happens, we get this kind of intercept on a letter, and it says, Rosa had said about him, met the divinest man, danced with him 6 times, a divine dancer. He is an advertising executive and is terribly, divinely good looking. We have a date, dinner in the theater. So he is hitting us over the head with this idea of divinity as a way of describing Walter, who is ruler of an army, right? So he goes to Margaret's one day and he's rummaging through her things. He touches her cool pillow. Just to address it very quickly, there is a kind of dichotomy within the text, a clear contrast between hot and heat and kind of warmth, and coolness and coldness on the other hand. When he's at Margaret's place and she's not there and he's just going through her stuff, he stroked his hand over the cool pillow, right? So whatever that's kind of representing there with that pillow in this kind of environment is cool. And I think when you think heat, think love. When you think heat, think love. At the end of this text, a sentence that really stands out is that it was all of the heat that was making him feel helpless. Later on, it does, at the very end of the story, it says, the heat frightened him, for it made him know tangibly his own helplessness. So his helplessness is directly tied to the heat that he is feeling, right? And it frightens him. And what I'm arguing here is that the heat is love. And I think at the very end of the text, just to speak with everything in mind here, I think it's the love of God that is frightening Walter, especially somebody who has never really offered himself or kind of opened himself up to love and opportunities of love because of the malice and the hatred that he has toward the world, because of his kind of affectation, right? So heat is love. And you might ask yourself, why would heat frighten me? Why would love frighten me? Well, God's love is one thing. God's love is truth, right? So God's love is as much, I would imagine, arguably on a thematic level, right? Thematically kind of speaking, that's a truth that can be very difficult, right, to deal with, especially if it kind of shatters your whole life, just like the glass in this text that shatters, right? And kind of, I think it's a catharsis for him at that point. Okay, back to this. So really quickly, he also remembers that they used to read the Sunday morning cartoons together. We get 3 specific allusions. Every time something's mentioned that comes from the real world, the external world from the story, you look these things up because you can quickly read up on a Wikipedia page and understand the details and characteristics that are being implied by the author. And we start with, I had to look all these people up, except Dick Tracy. I might look young, however, I was a teenager when that movie hit. I was a pretty young kid, Dick Tracy, and I know enough about Dick Tracy where I don't think I have to look him up. So the first one here, though, is Barney Google. And it's interesting to see Capote using the word Google way back when. Obviously, it's a word, right? That just a lot of people didn't know about. So Barney Google was basically, he's a character in a comic strip, and he's basically like a gambler, really. He's kind of a, what do you say, a opportunistic kind of, nice guy, but definitely a gambler. It says like the comic strips are about him betting on horse races and just taking risks and doing things of a risky nature. So Barney Google, taking risks. Gambling, right? Gambling is the ultimate form of taking risk, but gambling is also a major way that corporations and businesses find success. The next one is Joe Palooka. Joe Palooka was a heavyweight, well, again, a cartoon strip, and heavyweight boxing champion. And if you look this up on Wikipedia, you could see they used this guy, Joe Palooka. It was so long ago that they used it for propaganda purposes, so kind of anti-Nazi. At least that was one of the pictures that I saw. But just to do is kind of like fighting crime. He's a boxer, so of course he's got this kind of physique and this aggression and this capability and this prowess where he can accomplish things the good old-fashioned way, right? And punch his way to success. That's pretty much the idea. Lastly was Dick Tracy. And like I said, I even had the toys, people. I even had the toys, and I collected a lot of toys, right? Dick Tracy, I would imagine, he's basically like a police detective, right? Who really kind of, I guess you could say, specializes in the underworld, right? And can take care of all of these kind of crime families and these crime syndicates that operate in the darker parts of society. So, again, I think you are talking about an aggression. When you think about Dick Tracy, the equivalent nowadays are, for people who watch CSI and Law and Order. I don't know if that's still on. But those movies express the same kind of characteristics that we cherish, that we find virtuous, like Dick Tracy would in this era. Notice what's happening here symbolically. Walter, ruler of army, a pretty prominent authority. He's basically remembering the beautiful times he spent with Margaret, or at least the memorable times that he spent with Margaret, and they're reading these comic strips. Boxer, gambler, and Dick Tracy, right? Those are the characteristics. Those are the human attitudes that they are engaged with when they are spending time together. And it's all a part of their characterization, right? Who they are, who they've become, who they will change to be. On the paragraph that begins, well, dislike was at least, dislike was at least positive. That paragraph, there's a lot of I'll just read it. He was never certain whether he liked X, and when he says X, obviously he's talking about like any person, right? Just a person in general. He's so broad, right? The hatred and the malice of Walter, and I think because he is basically, more importantly, a symbolic character, but that hatred and malice, it is for everybody, right? X, your name there, right? So I'll just read this. He was never certain whether he liked X or not. He needed X's love, but was incapable of loving. He could never be sincere with X, never tell him more than 50% of the truth. He even says him there, so he's talking about friends, you know, girlfriends, friends, anybody. This is how he feels. On the other hand, it was impossible for him to permit X these same imperfections. Somewhere along the line, Walter was sure he'd be betrayed. Well, yeah. When you don't trust anybody and when you don't open yourself up to love and kind of can let those walls down, yes, you're always going to have these feelings that you're going to be betrayed in the end. He was afraid of X, terrified. Once in high school, he plagiarized a poem and printed it out in the school magazine. He could not forget its final line. All our acts are acts of fear. And when his teacher caught him out, had anything ever seemed to him more unjust? I got fooled the first time I read that, this paragraph at the end. I thought that the injustice was him committing the act of plagiarism, but I don't think that's the way that Walter looks at it. Walter sees the injustice as the fact that he was called out on it. Right? Why are you going to call me out on plagiarism? And of course these words are important. All our acts are acts of fear. That's what he plagiarizes. That's what he copies from history. Remember, we talked about a cycle of words, a cycle of emotions, a cycle of attitudes that will be here forever, right? And ever, as long as humanity is on this earth. Well, what he copied was all our acts are acts of fear. That's what he copied, which means he operates from fear, which is to say that what he represents, which is Walter, a man of kind of war, a military ruler, they operate out of fear, preemptive. It makes perfect sense. You look at the Cold War, you look at some of the nuclear proliferation, which, scary enough, is still taking place. Some people do say this world's not going to go down because of global warming. This world's not going to go down because of just random natural disasters. This world will go down because we will exterminate ourselves with nuclear warfare. There are some people who firmly believe that's the biggest threat that we face today, which is why you should be very concerned about Russia and the United States, because as far as I understand, they have 90% of the world's stockpile of nuclear arms, meaning other countries, big super countries, superpowers, are sharing that 10%. But as a Russia and the US, and if you follow the news, there's rhetoric that they're both building their nuclear capabilities. While some people say, let's slow this down and disarm. Okay. So we do find out that Rosa is never really serious about Walter. So really that's not going to go anywhere. It was never really a serious relationship. So the paragraph that begins with, Anna was good to him though, reinforces the idea that she is essentially the person that Walter confesses to. And confession is easily given a kind of religious connotation. And so this is the person that Walter, for all of his, let's say, hatred, malice, maybe the kind of sinful nature that he feels represents him, all of this has to come out. All this has to kind of, be vented out. And so, of course, she is his confidant, Anna Stimson. Anna, remember, is favor and the grace of God. And Stimson represents, if you look, it's pretty amazing when you look up the name, crown and wreath. When you think crown and wreath, you obviously think of, the thorned crown of Christ, or really any royalty or lord, right? Anna Stimson talks about her son. She says he was a nasty child. He liked to take pot shots out the window with a .22. So we're talking about, again, we can take these just kind of offhanded, as offhanded comments. But I think if you analyze them, what you're looking at is guns and violence. Things to keep in mind. Guns fix problems. That's kind of the idea, right? If you look at billboards for films, there's, especially for those action films, which tend to be the biggest ones, superhero movies, stuff like that, there's always a gun there. And the message that sends to young people, and really to us older people as well, is guns and heroes go hand in hand, because it's always the hero holding a gun, right? So they fix problems. They help us to make kind of virtuous changes in the world, right? If I'm using a gun, that means I'm on the side of good here. So he's shooting a 22 out the window. He's throwing things. We actually had a reference to throwing things earlier as well, or actually later on, there'll be a reference to throwing when he throws the glass paperweight out the window, trying to hit the pigeon, which again is a religious symbol, right? So aggression, right? The need to throw something. You get so frickin' mad that you just throw something, right? Whether it's a bottle or your keys, right? It happens. People do this. All right. And lastly, and steal from Woolworth's awful brat. Another thing that Anna Stimson's son does, this horrible kid, I guess, he steals. What do imperialist nations do? What does colonialism do? It steals. We're talking about kind of individual characteristics that allow something like imperialism to be so successful in the world. And we're getting some of those details through Anna Stimson's son. Despite that, Anna is good to him. She even says it. So despite his horrible behavior, her son, especially given like very imperialistic kind of feeling, she's still nice to her son. So the paragraph that starts with, or I was in a bookshop. This is something that Walter confesses to Anna, and he's again confessing, very important things that he's trying to make sense of. And one thing he does is, he has this weird experience on the streets of New York here, and there's a man following him. The man is described right away as middle-aged, rather nice, and very intelligent. Who wouldn't want to be affiliated or just kind of encounter somebody who was middle-aged, not bad, rather nice, and very intelligent, right? Especially the really nice and very intelligent. I crossed the street, he crossed the street. Cross might be interesting if you think about this in a particular way. I'll skip a couple sentences. So I stopped at the corner and hailed a cab. Then I turned around and gave this guy a long, long look, and he came rushing up, all smiles. And I jumped in the cab and slammed the door and leaned out the window and laughed out loud. Laughed at the guy who was just smiling at him, just ha, slammed the door on him, probably trying to share a cab with him. Let's talk, let's meet, let's actually maybe make a friend here. Slams the door on him and laughs in his face. Then he says, it was awful, it was like Christ. So the look, you can imagine the shock look, right? The look on this man's face reminds him of Christ. So we're getting, I think, when there's this kind of subtle hinting at symbolism that really helps us kind of understand the story, I think what you find some authors doing once in a while, especially like Capote, from what I've noticed, is that he'll throw something really hard-hitting and kind of undeniable. Let me just throw Christ down, right? Because Christ is such a profound figure, especially as far as literature goes. I teach so many stories, right? And I teach as many stories as somebody can teach, right? But you always find themes of Christ and what he represents in many people's writing, at least writing that's kind of based in this kind of Western religious culture. So Capote's throwing it in there, right? The characteristics of Christ. And I think you got to ask yourself, where does Christ fall? The characteristics of Christ, where do those characteristics fall as far as again, aggressiveness, or just kind of stillness and calmness and kind of keeping things, just staying to yourself, right? Or are we looking for all of these things that Walter is being affiliated with? And then he says, I can't forget it, and tell me, Anna, why do I do this crazy thing? It was like paying back all the people who ever hurt me, but it was something else too. Why does he do it? Why does he slam the door in this guy's face, and the guy's face is so shocked and probably a little kind of saddened? I would imagine that Walter says, it was like getting back at everybody who'd ever hurt me. So he's taking it out on Christ. Christ is essentially a scapegoat for him in this moment. After he tells these stories, the last sentence of that paragraph, he would tell Anna these stories, go home and go to sleep. His dreams were clear blue. If you look up the meaning of blue, you get healing power of God, at least on a biblical level, that is. Healing power of God, and usually that's where Christ plays a large role. Redemption, forgiveness, atonement. Christ plays a large role with healing power and God. So after having this kind of strange experience in telling this to Anna, you basically have him feeling like there's a little bit of healing taking place here, which is what we want for Walter's character. I said it before just to remind the class, there's definitely a kind of motif of heat versus cold, or warmth versus cool, and I think what you find there is really love. A love that is so powerful that it can kind of make a profound change in your life, right? Change who you are, change everything. So that heat is love, and then the coldness and the coolness is when we are unloved, right? When we don't have that love in our lives. In the paragraph that begins, not the problem of love concerned him, mainly because he did not consider it a problem. So in that paragraph, she does some interesting discussion about things aren't what they seem to be. And then she even says, I'll just read this, nothing, Walter, is ever what it seems to be. Christmas trees are cellophane, and snow is only soap chips. Flying around inside us is something called the soul. Now, it can be tricky to read here, but I think she's saying it's so weird that there's this thing that's flying around in us called the soul. She's kind of saying that's what it is, that's what happens. And when you die, you're never dead, right? Things aren't what they seem to be. You would think, upon appearances at least, that when you die, that's it. It's all done. But if you take into account this idea of a soul, right, that has a kind of continuance, or the prospects or potential for continuance, then you're talking about something on a religious level, right? She says, it's weird though, you know, even if you were to die, you're not really dead. Then she goes on to say, and when you're alive, you're not really alive, which is to say that, Walter, you're not really living in the way that you should be living, right? You're kind of going in the wrong direction, especially when you think about his ambitions and his drive and his aggressiveness within the field of advertising, right? And we've talked about that a lot here. So on page 127, let's see here, he does a weird thing, and I think he calls a journalist, and he basically says, guess what, I'm getting engaged to Rosa Cooper, and I think from what we get here, it's described as being, it was just a big lie. And why would he do it? He knows that it's not a good relationship. He doesn't feel a real kind of love toward, or real feelings toward Rosa. We know that Rosa doesn't feel it to him, but he still says to the newspaper, guess what, we're getting married, right? So he kind of, in a sneaky way, make her. Of course, she's very she's very kind of, I guess you could say, insulted and ultimately kind of, you know, disheartened by this. And she says it was a very cheap thing to do. I'll let you make of that what you will. So he gets pretty upset, and he knows he did the wrong thing, and he gets pretty upset, and he goes up to his apartment. He kind of has this moment of indecisiveness. He doesn't know how he wants his beard to be or his hair to be, and he's kind of at a loss. And I think what that means is this is a very malleable state for him. This is the perfect moment where all of these kind of established characteristics of boldness and hardness and aggressiveness, all of these in this moment have the ability to be kind of reconfigured and rewired and resituated. And that's why he's like, I don't even know what I want to look like. Meaning, I don't know what I want to be like, right? On a psychological and kind of, you know, religious and emotional level. So we get a thing where there's just a bunch of symbolism tied up in here. A pigeon strutted on the ledge outside his window. A pigeon is, you know, also a dove. It's a turtle dove. And in a religious symbolism, it is the Holy Spirit. God, right? It kind of, I guess, a vessel of God. Popular Christian symbol, especially, it was a very popular Christian symbol, especially before the cross was available as a symbol. And now we know the cross is the big one that everyone, that you see everywhere. But the dove is big. Some of you might have gone to churches where a dove is on the church, right? It's part of their symbol. It's a part. He throws a glass paperweight at the pigeon. So we had throwing earlier as something described that Anna Stimson's son does. It's the same characteristic that Anna Stimson's son was demonstrating. So he throws it, it's glass. I think glass is transparency here. One thing that I would say is quite abundant in Walter's life and hence the trial and very difficult ordeal that Walter is going through. So he's always had a lot of transparency with the people around him, because they're always being quite honest with him, and he realizes kind of how bad his situation is. So the pigeon doesn't really mind. It doesn't really paying attention. So you have kind of God not really paying too much attention to the anger that he's feeling and the way that he's expressing it. It falls like a raindrop. Raindrops will occur by the end of the text as well, I think toward the end. And he has this weird moment where he's like, I wonder if my glass paperweight that I just threw out the window because I was angry at this pigeon will kill somebody. Will I hear a faraway scream? And will I kill somebody? It's a weird thought to have. And I'm not even sure how to analyze that. I'd love to hear what you have to say. But it's a weird kind of feeling to have here. There's nothing. Nothing is on the same level of calmness and stillness and emptiness, not a negative emptiness, but a rather kind of positive one, because it's a chance to be calm and to be still and not have to feel these pressuring emotions that Walter is used to feeling. The only thing that he does here, he doesn't hear nothing, but he does hear one thing. He hears the typists typing away. And then there's a knock at the door to fire him. So that's what he hears instead. He doesn't hear anything from this aggression and kind of expression. God even barely takes notice to it. God's kind of doing his own thing here, at least the pigeon, the Holy Spirit in this paragraph. He gets fired. We knew that was coming. It was prophesied by Margaret. Margaret is described in a subsequent paragraph as actually still having some sympathies for him. So Margaret is given a kind of positive characteristic in that regard, right? She's always been that desire, but once that desire became too much for Walter, she said, cool it. You better watch yourself. And when he doesn't follow that advice, and it comes true that he essentially gets fired, too ambitious, right? That's what it was. She still has sympathy for him, right? So Margaret is a pretty positive character symbolically in the text. He has a feeling as he's leaving his job. He's just been let go. What are you going to do? He has this feeling, I wish I could go back to Benny's. He wants to go get a drink with Margaret at Benny's. And remember who we left at Benny's. We left Irving at Benny's. So he wants to go back to that time of his life when Irving was still a influence, that calmness and that stillness. He's trying to go back to it. It will be desperate in the last few pages of this story as he tries to get back to nothing, especially when he starts to hear the banging of the army on the door, right? And it's a weird way to describe the stress and anxieties that he's feeling in that moment. She's wearing blue ribbons when they say goodbye to each other after he's lost his job. Her eyes soften in the last moment that they talk to each other. She is likened with the color blue here, a blue hair ribbon, and I think we talked about the symbolism earlier on that. And she can't tell if it's a softness or if she's really just pitying him. But even if it's pity, we know that Walter probably is in need even of pity at this point in his life. He wants to go back and, like I had mentioned, and spend time at Benny's, which is to get back in touch with Irving and what Irving represents. I just didn't want to forget to, on page 127 at the In the paragraph that begins with, now in the elevator, the enemy all submerging with him. Notice we get the word enemy once again. And if you remember the symbolism of Walter's name, he is surrounded by what he considers enemies. Even Margaret walks in and briefly is considered an enemy before we see her quite compassionate side, and we realize she is not an enemy. She definitely is not. But everyone else is still kind of likened to enemy, to kind of raise it to that dramatic level. He becomes quite nihilistic and quite kind of defeated in the paragraph that begins with his apartment, a one-room walk-up near Gramercy Park. He says, what was the use? No matter what you did or how hard you tried, it all came finally to zero. Every day, everywhere, everyone was being cheated, and who was there to blame? That's a very nihilistic attitude to kind of have. I guess you could even probably say this might be the climax of the story. The climax are when the obstacles against the protagonist are kind of at their biggest, and things seem hopeless. And when you're basically saying that the problem is too big to solve, how can you stop it? You're just being kind of a defeatist, and you've kind of given up on the issue to make things easier on yourself. But then it goes on to say he feels very calm than he had for God knows how long. Again, God knows. We're always considering what God knows, especially about somebody like Walter. Then he says it was like the time he'd failed algebra and was so relieved. Now, I like this line for a couple different reasons. One, I don't like math. So somebody finding relief in failing math, cool with me, especially as an English instructor. I'm all about that. But I think on a more meaningful level, you're failing a mathematical discourse that basically is, correct me if I'm wrong, deals with accumulation. 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 5 times 9, divided by 14 times 20. Who knows what math is? Especially math that's used for a kind of calculative and in a gainful way. That I'm using math to screw you over, right? 1 plus 1 equals 2. That I'm using math to basically condition myself to only see happiness in accumulation, right? More and more and more. And he finds a relief in failing algebra. I love this. He finds relief in failing to look at life as 1 plus 2 will equal 3 plus 4 will. Constant need for advancement, to move up, to have more, to earn more. That is what's getting in the way for Walter. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. And at this point in the lecture, I do want to kind of ask that personal question. Do you feel this? Do you feel this pressure, right, as a part of who you are and kind of what's important to you and how you go about your life and present yourself and go about your business? Is it all about just like, I'm going to do whatever it takes, and I'm going to earn the most, and I'm going to walk over? We don't say this, but is this how we feel? Think about me, myself included. I'm going to walk over this person so I can get that job and that promotion, and then when I'm going to get this, I'm going to buy this. I mean, how much is that just a part of what drives us? And are we going in a kind of wrong direction? Especially when we think about, when you think about that guy who had the door slammed on him. When Walter slammed the door on him in the middle of the street, not sharing my cab, right, and slams the door. Okay, so he's happy he fails algebra. He's happy to fail. He feels calm about it. This whole idea of 1 plus 1, advancement, right, never ending. He has a memory about his father here. And we don't get a lot about the father, but he remembers being at Saratoga with his pop. He goes on to say, I'll just read the whole thing because I think I'm probably not realizing how important it is. He says, failure was definite, a certainty, and there is always peace in certainties, meaning you can find peace in the certainty of failure, right? I guess a lot of angst we have about life is, I'm not going to fail this. You don't want to fail this class. You don't want to fail that driver's ed test. You don't want to fail that business. You don't want to fail your mom. You don't want to fail your dad, right? And it kind of drives us to be people, a certain kind of person that exists in the world. If there wasn't that fear of being a failure, And that goes back to the words that he plagiarizes, right? Everything comes from fear. But if it wasn't for that fear that makes you kind of, go the extra mile and stay those extra hours and get that degree and get an A in this class, if it wasn't fear, would you be a different person? Would life be different? It's a pretty interesting question. How much does fear kind of, drive you? So I think overall, you're looking at a theme of kind of losing religion, right? Somebody who's either lost it or long time ago and is trying to get it back. So I think you are talking about this idea of a lost religion and trying to somehow get that back. That's what Walter is going through on a big thematic level, that is. He remembers Saratoga. The paragraph that begins, and wondering where he should go, he all at once saw. Basically just the race tracks. And you got guys in silk caps. So silk is very fancy and expensive, right? Very luxurious. Makes you think of imperialism on some levels. A little wise-faced man wearing exquisite polka dot shirts. The only thing I can imagine with those polka dots is it definitely gets me thinking of circles, and when you talk about circles as a motif in this story, you're talking about, again, words and attitudes and everything kind of just recycling throughout time, right? It's with us always, all of these opposing characteristics of ourselves. He's got his father's big pair of binoculars, so whatever his dad represents, we'll see his dad one last time in the procession of kind of people coming in those limos in his dream, so it's quite morbid. But here he's got the big binoculars, which means his dad really helped him focus in on the racetracks and what they represent. And what are the racetracks? It's a competition, right? Your school is a competition. The workforce is a competition. So it's that notion of competition. And he's like, Dad, give me your binoculars. I can really look at this competition. I can see it, right? Meaning he's absorbing it. It's a part of who he is. It's a part of how he thinks. Okay. That dream of the racetrack and the ideas I just mentioned, that is all quickly ended by the telephone that rings. It's a pretty opportune time. Oh, you're having this dream, telephone call, let's snap you out of it. Essentially snapped out of it. Snapped out of that dream. We're talking about the racetrack, right? The voice that answers is dry and sexless and altogether unlike any he'd ever heard before. I'll just say it because I think this is my analysis on the story. I think this is the voice of God. Of course, that operates on a very figurative level. God's voice would be dry. When you're that wise and that all-powerful and that all-knowing, there's no need to kind of, embellish your voice or anything. It's like a dry sense of humor. You've seen everything. You know everything. So you say anything to me and I'm just going to be like, all right? So that supports this idea of God. Sexless definitely supports the idea of God, at least on a very spiritual level. Most people have a kind of, at least when they think of the Western God, at least they think of a male God. But it's still sexless in the sense that it is not, sexually, it doesn't think sexually, right? When we think of God, we don't think of a sexuality necessarily. He's an old dude, gray, with a gray beard. But we don't think of him, having a certain yearning for or capability for any kind of sexual activity. So that makes sense. God's voice would be sexless. And unlike any he'd ever heard before, that might be because Walter and what he represents has never really been fully given the favor or the word of God, right? So it's a completely new familiar. That is all the way up until right now, where the phone call is coming through, which snaps him out of that dream about the racetrack. Moving on. So page 130 is a pretty interesting, especially as far as the imagery goes. I got, as you can see, a lot of notes on this page, but I'll try to go through it very quickly. But it's probably one of the most important parts of the story because this seems to be the, I would say this is kind of the, I would even say this is the resolution in some ways, right? Because I think we've passed a pretty inherent drama in the story But of course, we still have this last couple pages where he meets up with this woman at the hotel. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But here he has this dream, and almost everybody he knows, but he's got negative, but there's negative characteristics that he seems to have obtained from all kinds of characters, or they've kind of affected him in a negative way. And here they all come, and it starts with a dad, binoculars at the racetrack. Then we got Kuhnhardt, which is a man who is essentially a contemporary of Walter, and here he comes right after the father, the wolf, right, and what he represents. Margaret and Rosa, even says someone no-faced, which is interesting. And they're all coming in limos, and everyone's dressed for funerals. And they all basically come up, they hold the door open, and then they basically, as he comes running up, Walter comes running up, they slam it in his face, just like he did to the man that he said looked like Christ on the street. So it's a direct parallel. And obviously now seeing it here, you go back to that paragraph if you're doing kind of a thorough analysis here, and you make sure you're kind of matching up some details here. So everyone's shutting doors. Everyone is shutting doors in his face. They're all throwing wreaths of roses at him, essentially crowns, right? They're throwing them to him. And then the no-faced creature comes out. He's a protege of Kuhnhardt, which means Kuhnhardt has moved on to his next second in command, the person he's going to help rise up, but surely, almost as prophesized, he will also be let go. It's a cycle, endless, right? Going back to endless. Then at the very end, very Christ-like references, and with a terrible scream, Walter fell among the mountains of roses. Thorns tore wounds. We're talking about the crown of thorns. And a sudden rain and a great cloudburst shattered the blossoms and washed pale blood, bleeding over the leaves. Yeah. This is probably, within this story, if you're looking for that biblical kind of, the overarching biblical theme, this is the crucifixion right here, right? If you're looking at the kind of literal religious crucifixion of Christ, here, especially with the thorns, you're talking about, this represents a crucifixion for Walter. We also get at some point there's the number 3, which is always a kind of a reference to the resurrection, right? So we've resurrected at that point. Capote, I mean, it's all very purposeful. You see Capote in the next paragraph, and he wakes up from this dream, and there's this woman that he kind of startles, and he smiles at her sheepishly. And when you think sheep, you think lamb. Who is Christ? Who is Christ, especially after the resurrection? He is the Lamb of God, right? So it's very much like Christ. Now let me say something, because I'm not going to do a big spiel at the end, but at the end of the text, he's worried. He's like, the phone is ringing, it's God. And all of a sudden he's worried because he knows he's going to hear he knows he's going to hear the knocking of an army at his door. You know, one thing you have to remember, especially on a kind of deeper and biblical level, Christ is a soldier. Christ is a ruler of an army, right? If you talk about the apocalypse and all that stuff, it's Christ who is going to lead kind of God's army against the forces of evil, right? So we are talking about a soldier. It's incredibly dramatic and incredibly interesting to think that at the end of this story, it is his army. Maybe it's an opposing army, but it's an army to say the least. And here we have Christ who realizes at this moment he has to lead the charge. And therefore you have this incessant ring on the telephone. Now that means that there needs to be a force of evil. Now that last woman, the woman with the medical issue in the foot, and she's there to be made an example of so people can learn from her ailment. She's definitely got characteristics of evil, right? The clubfoot is definitely devil. I've read a couple stories where you have a character with a kind of deformed foot, which is essentially a characteristic flaw, which could even be like sin and vice and immorality, right? So she covers it with a shoe, and she even says, "Don't look at the foot. Don't look at any of this because it makes me nervous." And I don't like people to see, I don't like people to see my foot, so I keep the shoe on it. It's a cover-up. In some ways, you can look at Walter's life and the ambition and the virtue of ambition that he surrounds himself with as a cover-up. And it's covering up really the torment and the negative feelings that all of this is bringing to him. Right? He feels like a pretty awful human being. So that's, really, I think that's one way of looking at it. I think he's on a literal level, I talk so much about the figurative, but on a literal level, you have an advertising executive who's been kind of baffled he's been overtaken by a need to succeed and to kind of rise above the next. On a more figurative level, you're talking about Christ fighting against these characteristics within the world, right? Fighting against a very kind of pure evil that is out there that has had an effect on so much of our lives, especially people who are ruthlessly ambitious, whether it be in the corporate world or the military world, where maybe in the military world they had a lot more time to kind of excel and take place, because that's history, right? Just read history, you can see about all of that. Okay. But before that, let me cover a couple more things here. I go back to one more time before we move on. Back to that paragraph where everybody's, it's a procession of all these people who are like laughing at him and closing the door. I think he's feeling the insults of the world. He's feeling the injustices of the world. It's coming from all directions, and I think that's on a symbolic level for Christ. That's kind of what he had to bear with him in going through the crucifixion and kind of making that incredibly important decision, right? And taking all of that away from humanity, right? The atonement that represents. Okay, so last couple things here. I find an interesting kind of paradox in juxtaposition at the end of this story. This woman is described as actually a very nice woman, the woman with the medical condition in the foot. She's not the mother of him. She actually watches over him. She watches this kid. She's kind of a homesitter. And she says, I'm better to him than his mother, and he loves me more. He's told me so. So she gets a special kind of providence. Back to the paradox here. You have this woman who has a external physical deformity on the outside, but on the inside it seems to be a very nice, kind-hearted individual. Then you have Walter, who on the outside is incredibly successful, incredibly what we would call a kind of legitimate and acceptable and even praised within our society, working for an advertising agency. Of course, he's just been fired, but still to reach that level of success, right? He probably looks good. However, on the inside, we know how tormented and how kind of psychologically and spiritually and emotionally flawed he truly is. He mentions his brain being kind of like glass toward the end here. That goes back to the glass paperweight that he tries to throw out the door toward the end. He doesn't have a place to stay on a literal level. There's also something interesting about medical convention. Medical meaning healing and curing, and we could relate that to a spiritual level. There's also a paradox here and a juxtaposition between a medical convention as juxtaposed or contrasted with Saratoga and the horse racing that it represents, right? We've already talked about the problematic attitudes of the racetrack and kind of risk and gambling and advancement and aggression. Over and over and over again, right? However, now we have this idea of medical convention. There's a moment where he even says, you must be here for the horse racing, having a negative view of humanity, right? That it is out for greed, out for this kind of recklessness. And she says, no, I'm actually here for the medical convention, which has a kind of positive attribute when we talk about healing, right? All right, very good. So they go up to her room, and there seems to be, they're about to have a sexual encounter here. And of course, it's on a literal level, on a very general level, it's very awkward. It doesn't seem like it's really going to work out. We have nothing but immense pity and sympathy for this woman in the sense that she has this deformity and she's so worried about covering it up. Everything has to be in the dark because she just does not want to be seen. They do get close here. And he came to the edge of the bed and bending kissed her cheek. I think you're so very sweet, but there is a kind of compassion. It seems authentic on behalf of Walter. it seems even more apt if we look at him as Christ giving this kind of compassion and sympathy to the sin, to those who have sinned, right? So and it feels that way because he's bending down. He's bending down to kiss her cheek, right? It's kind of a show of compassion and grace. Okay, the telephone interrupts. She looked at him dumbly. Jesus, God, she said. She's basically saying it's Jesus and God on the phone right now, or maybe even bringing those together. Jesus, God, she said. As the phone rings, it's not for her, it's for him, oddly enough. They have an embrace. She says, poor little boy, she said, patting his back, my poor little boy. We're awfully alone in this world, aren't we? So she reciprocates the kind of compassion and feeling for him. She likens him to a little boy, which is to go back to a state of innocence and purity. Isn't that what redemption is? It's taking us back, hopefully, some way, somehow, to that state. Does mention that he's pretty despondent here at the end, too. He says, it's described four spinning fan blades, wheels and voices round and round, and after all, as he saw it now, there was to this network of malice no ending, no whatever. So a network of hate, which just kind of continues for all time. There's no end to it. There is silence in the room. He's been looking for silence, but maybe he can't escape it. I mentioned earlier the heat and the fear and the helplessness. He's scared of this. He's scared of that telephone call. And it's God's love coming through, right? Maybe that's what it is. God's love coming through, and it's very frightening for him. And at this moment, he wants to think of nothing, because at the rate that phone is ringing, at the rate God is talking to him, he feels that any minute now there's going to be an army at my door, pounding at the door. And he doesn't want this to happen, so he pushes his face into the pillow, covered his ears with his hands, and thought, think of nothing things, think of wind. He's trying to get back in touch at the very end here with Irving and what Irving represents. But he can't stop it. I mean, it's a pretty unfortunate ending in the sense that this ringing and what's kind of tormenting him, it's not going to stop, which means he's going to have to pick up the phone. And I guess he's going to have to kind of accept this army. And I guess there's a couple interpretations you can have about the army here at the end of the text. One, if you're looking at him as still Christ, obviously that Christ symbolism really seems to be active earlier in the text. So at the end here, it could be Christ leading the kind of forces of good and the forces of God against the kind of devilish intentions of the world, right? And everything that's kind of actively working against what is good. So he's got to lead that fight. Another way, ruler of army. If it's an army, if it's his army at the door also, even on a general level, he has to lead that fight, and that's going to lead to aggression and assertiveness and everything we could on one level classify as virtuous within the world, because it leads to results, and it's things that need to kind of get done. On another level here, he just wants to cancel all of that out so that he can just have that peace and that quiet, and that's really all he is searching for at the very end here. So you might ask yourself, who's calling on a literal level? Figurative level, I think it just screams God, right? God is calling him. On a literal level, don't know really. I think Irving might be it. Irving, the same person who, in a sexless way you could say, hung out at a bar where women were wearing slacks, which is to say that maybe we have a kind of blurring of these, who the aggressors are and ideas about aggression. Probably worth mentioning here at the end. I might have mentioned this with the last lecture, but I've mentioned this in other lectures. Some people would argue that what we really need within this world is not these kind of aggressive, which tend to be male characteristics, right? When you think of aggressive men or aggressive traits, they are likened to men. Men are the aggressors. We see this in corporate America. You see this in sports, military. You see this all over the place. STEM careers, you see this all over the place. So to be successful is to be aggressive. To be aggressive is to be a man. But there is this kind of counter argument that the world is in such bad shape especially when you think about all the things that are happening, that maybe we need feminine characteristics, gentleness, warmth, the reluctance to use force, perhaps, right? There are very different ideas about femininity, or I should say there are very different ideas about what the virtuous strength of a female are. Is it the mothering and the nurturing and the keeping from harm and being very kind of, I guess you could say protective? Is that what we should cherish, or do we cherish that women can be as equally aggressive and astute and ambitious and etc. as men? There's two very different forms of it. Jill Stein talked about this in the last election. Hillary Clinton, as she argued, was one form of kind of feminist, and then she was a very different form of feminist, thinking that women need to be the eternal mothers of the world and keep it from harm and work together to keep it from harm. What I mean to say is, maybe we need those characteristics, the motherly, the characteristics that are not so quick to react. Maybe we need those in the world and not this male aggression, which seems to be leading in some pretty destructive directions. One last kind of theme I just want to mention here is, on a personal level, when you think about what you desire out of life, good job, but why do you want that job? To have a nice house? Why do you want that nice house? All these questions. How much does what you get from all of your hard work, the cars that you drive, the restaurants that you eat at, the vacations that you take, how much do those things, those material things, how much does that mask the real happiness that you're feeling inside? Perhaps even on a spiritual level, when we consider some essential moral and ethical questions. When I think about that vacation that I took a couple summers ago to Hawaii, does that mask in some kind of way, the real kind of ideas that kind of torment me on a more kind of frequent basis, right? Do we just cover up with the material world? Okay, he returns to a boy-like state on page 133 when she's kind of patting him, which is probably a good thing for him before he has these, this pretty difficult situation to deal with at the end. Okay, so I feel like I've definitely talked about a lot of important ways of looking at this text. I do think Capote had some kind of clear religious kind of references in mind, and the ideas that kind of pertain to those references, but I always like to hear other interpretations as well. Don't forget that this is a story that can completely operate on a literal level as we follow him through the kind of pangs of ambition and jealousy and all these things in the advertising field. All right, see you next lecture. Thank you.